When studying the Battle of Leyte Gulf, you will start to pick up on certain trends. Notably that all the attention is focused on the big names. Coverage of lesser-known ships tends to be lacking. You can even see this with Samar, where Johnson and Sammy B tend to get most of the attention. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, you have another destroyer against impossible odds. The Akizuki-class ship, Hatsuzuki. This destroyer faced down a force of American cruisers and destroyers, and she did it alone. This was done to cover the rescue of survivors from sunken Japanese carriers. A story in action that could only ever end one way. It's still something worth remembering. I'll cover that in this video after the design overview and the rest of her service history. Starting, of course, with the design detail. Hatsuzuki displaced around 2,700 tons at her standard loading. This rose as high as 3,700 tons at full load. On that displacement, the destroyer carried a unique loadout. 4 twin mounts for the excellent Japanese 10cm gun. I have a video covering this weapon, which I'll link below. However, for the short version, this was a very high-velocity weapon designed to rectify issues in Japanese dual-purpose mounts, which, as a general rule, had either low-velocity shells, slow traverse on mounts, or both. The Akizuki mount was much faster, and the 10cm gun had very high velocity. For an anti-aircraft gun, both of those improvements were useful. The Japanese, for their part, considered it their best dual-purpose weapon. Hatsuzuki carried 8 such guns in the aforementioned twin mounts, a super-firing pair on the bow and another pair on the stern. In a reflection of the Akizuki being intended for anti-aircraft work, those were the main weaponry. This was a sharp break from tradition, especially in Japan, where torpedoes were king for destroyers. In fact, Hatsuzuki only carried a single quadruple torpedo tube mount. This did come with the traditional Japanese reloads, for a total of 8 torpedoes in all. 4 in the mount, with a full reload of 4 spares. To support this, the destroyer carried the usual swarm of 25mm morale boosters. The Type 96 25mm gun to be more formal. The exact number would vary based on ship and time period, ranging as high as 50 or more barrels. Rounding off the weaponry past this point, you had the usual depth charge racks on the stern, although anti-submarine warfare was definitely a secondary role here. As for speed, this was good enough. 33 or so knots on 50,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts. Not particularly slow, but also not particularly fast by the standard of contemporary destroyers. With that rounding off the design, let's move to service. That began on July 25, 1941, when the ship that became Hatsuzuki was laid down. Her construction went at a fairly typical pace, with the destroyer launched on April 3, 1942. More impressively, especially considering this isn't the United States, Hatsuzuki would be commissioned on December 29, 1942. It took only a few months from launch to commissioning. Her actual service didn't begin until 1943. By this point in the war, Japan was very much on the defensive. Allied forces were rolling up the Solomons and pushing through the defense perimeter in the Central Pacific. That could have meant Hatsuzuki being deployed into the meat grinder. As it turned out, that didn't happen. For the entirety of 1943, Hatsuzuki operated on escort duty. This was, in fairness, what the ship was designed to do. However, it does mean she missed the fierce engagements that her sisters, like Teruzuki or Nizuki, got themselves into. Instead, Hatsuzuki bounced between Truk, the South Pacific, and Japan. This would see her escort everything from transports to aircraft carriers. Not particularly flashy duty, but still important work. Probably the most exciting bits in this period were transport runs to the South Pacific in July 1943, along with supporting 2 Japanese cruisers with their damage. First, the cruiser Aoba bombed and burning on April 3rd, and then the cruiser Agano, which was torpedoed in November 1943. Hatsuzuki helped with the escort back to Truk from November 12th to the 15th. After this, it was back to more typical escort duty, which would continue through to January 1944. Late in that month, specifically January 16th, Hatsuzuki helped another torpedoed Japanese warship. In this case, it was her own sister ship, Suzuki, which had been torpedoed on a transport run to Wake Island. This blew the destroyer's bow off as far back as the number 2 gun mount. Not surprising when the torpedo had detonated the forward magazine. Hatsuzuki took her sister under tow and took the crippled Suzuki back to Kure for repair work. Then it was back to her own old work, at least until the destroyer had her first taste of real battle, that being the Battle of the Philippine Sea, better known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. This would have been the perfect time to put those fancy 10cm guns to work, but Hatsuzuki was kept busy helping yet another torpedoed ship. In this case, the stricken Taiho. Hatsuzuki helped the carrier with damage control and, eventually, with rescuing survivors as the ship sank. Hatsuzuki would carry those survivors back to Japan, where the destroyer remained on training from July through October, along with routine maintenance and overhaul. When that period came to an end in early October, Hatsuzuki left Japan. The destroyer joined up with the Northern Force for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, more commonly known as the Decoy Force, comprised of most of Japan's remaining carriers, such as they were at this point of the war. This was not a force that could fight the American Navy on anything resembling an equal footing. What it could do, and did succeed at doing, was dragging the impulsive Admiral Halsey up to attack it. This took place on October 25th, 1944. This attack, known as the Battle of Cape Engano, is well known. It saw the end of the final Pearl Harbor carrier in the form of the veteran Zuikaku, alongside the destruction of 3 light carriers, Suiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. The last of the 3, Chiyoda, would only be crippled by the air attack, and ultimately sunk by cruiser gunfire. This was the first Japanese ship sunk by American gunfire during this battle. The second would be Hatsuzuki in her doomed final stand. Details of this are frustratingly vague. Even Combined Fleet only has a short blurb. The best information that I've found comes from the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships on USS Wichita. Even this doesn't have much detail, but it's a source I generally trust. I'll also sprinkle in some details from the Japanese wiki page, but with 2 important notes there. First, wiki, no matter the language, should always be taken with a heaping mountain of salt. It's better now than it used to be, but this is still Wikipedia. And secondly, I don't speak Japanese, so machine translation funkiness is also present. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's look at the final stand. Hatsuzuki was engaged in picking up survivors from Zuikaku. She was joined in this by the fellow destroyer Wakatsuki and the cruiser Isuzu. Those ships were also picking up survivors from Zuikaku and Zuiho. Around 6:40 p.m. on October 25th, the little group of Japanese ships were spotted. In the gathering darkness, the American ships moved in for the kill. This formation consisted of the heavy cruisers, Wichita and New Orleans, alongside the light cruisers, Santa Fe and Mobile, with several destroyers and support. Exactly why Hatsuzuki turned to engage this formation is a bit of a mystery. It might have been to cover the escape of the other ships. It might have been some, we can't escape, so might as well go down fighting. I like to think it was as a shield to let the other ships escape myself. Regardless, Hatsuzuki would engage the American formation. The destroyer put up a smokescreen, opening fire on the American ships. She also sent off a signal to Isuzu, informing them of the action. The American cruisers, for their part, returned fire. Exactly which one fired first is an open question. Japanese wiki states it was Mobile, but the fighting ship entry for that ship gives no detail. Wichita's entry states she opened fire at 7:10 p.m. for its part. Soon after the cruisers opened up, Hatsuzuki closed in and launched a volley of torpedoes. Possibly 2 volleys, but the details are sparse here. At some point, Hatsuzuki was hit by shell fire and caught on fire. The destroyer burned, but continued to steam at around 20 knots for some time. In fact, for over an hour, Hatsuzuki continued to fire back at the American fleet while maintaining at least some speed. However, this wouldn't last forever. Details are, again, mixed. But at some point between 8 and 8:50 that night, Hatsuzuki was finally brought to a halt. The ship was spotted burning and floating in place as American ships closed in. If it was a torpedo that brought the ship to a halt is not entirely clear. Either way, the American ships closed in for the kill, with Wichita's fighting ship entry stating that the destroyer blew up and sank at 8:56 p.m. on October 25, 1944. Regardless of if the killing blow was gunfire or torpedoes, Hatsuzuki put up a fierce delaying action. For 2 hours, she kept the American formation busy. Isuzu and Wakatsuki were, as a result, able to escape. It came at the cost of most of Hatsuzuki's crew. 8 of the destroyer's crew and 17 Zuikaku survivors were the only ones to survive. They had been lowered into a boat prior to the battle, and after 21 days, made it to Taiwan. The remainder of the crew, and many Zuikaku survivors, went down with the ship. It's a shame this story isn't better known. Japanese ship or not, Hatsuzuki fought a brave action here. I think it's worth remembering. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.